The rise of a giant and the trap of the century. The economic miracle that vanished. Imagine a nation that rose from ashes. One that turned total destruction into total domination. A nation that built cars, cameras, and computers so good, the rest of the world could barely compete. Its people worked harder, saved more, and believed their success was unstoppable. But what if that success wasn't just lost? What if it was stolen? Not with bombs or armies, but with currencies, agreements, and quiet diplomacy. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's a documented economic story of how the United States, in trying to save itself, set a trap that would send Japan into decades of stagnation. A nation that once looked destined to surpass America ended up stuck in time. Welcome to the lost decade, and how the U.S. tricked Japan into it. From ruins to riches, 1945 to 1980. To understand Japan's fall, we must first understand its impossible rise. Because what Japan achieved in just 40 years took other nations centuries. Rebirth after war. The year was 1945. Japan had lost everything. Cities like Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Tokyo lay in rubble. Its empire collapsed, its economy obliterated. Millions were homeless. Factories destroyed. Food scarce. Yet within one generation, Japan became a global superpower, not through conquest but through creation. And here's the twist. America helped it happen. The hidden hand of America. In the aftermath of World War II, the U.S. feared one thing above all: the spread of communism. China had fallen to Mao. The Korean War was raging. Southeast Asia was unstable. America needed a strong capitalist ally in Asia, a showcase of prosperity to prove that democracy and free markets could defeat communism. That ally became Japan. Under General Douglas MacArthur's occupation, Japan was rebuilt from the ground up. The U.S. rewrote Japan's constitution, reformed its education, and opened its industries to Western technologies. American loans and investments poured in. The same nation that once bombed Pearl Harbor was now America's most important partner in Asia. But there was a quiet understanding. Japan would grow within America's system, not beyond it. The Japanese miracle. By the 1950s and 60s, Japan entered what economists call the miracle era. It grew faster than any major economy in modern history. From 1955 to 1973, Japan's GDP grew at an average of 10% per year, double that of the United States. Cities like Osaka and Tokyo transformed from industrial ruins into modern skylines filled with neon lights, factories, and bullet trains. The world watched in disbelief as Japanese products, once mocked as cheap imitations, became synonymous with quality. Sony revolutionized electronics. Toyota redefined automobiles. Panasonic, Honda, Canon, Toshiba, each became a global household name. By the 1980s, Japan had done the impossible. It had risen from defeat to dominance. The cultural engine behind the miracle. But Japan's strength wasn't just its factories or exports, it was its people. The Japanese work ethic became legendary. Lifetime employment, devotion to company, meticulous quality control. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry, known as MITI, guided the nation's economy with precision. It directed resources to key industries, protected domestic champions, and ensured that innovation stayed Japanese. It was capitalism but with government planning. A system so efficient that even Western economists couldn't explain it. To many, Japan looked like the future. To America, it looked like a threat. The fear of Japanese dominance. By 1985, the numbers were terrifying, at least to Washington. Japan had become the world's largest creditor nation. Its trade surplus with the U.S. exceeded $50 billion, a massive figure at the time. Japanese cars were dominating American roads. Sony had bought Columbia Pictures. Mitsubishi purchased chunks of New York real estate. And in 1989, when Japanese investors bought the iconic Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, Americans panicked. Media headlines screamed, "Japan buys America." Best-selling books warned that Japan was taking over the world. Meanwhile, American factories were closing. Unemployment was rising. The U.S. economy, weighed down by trade deficits, was losing confidence. Something had to change, and fast. The trap. The Plaza Accord, 1985. On September 22, 1985, inside the Plaza Hotel in New York City, the world's most powerful finance ministers met behind closed doors. They were about to change the global economy, and Japan's destiny, forever. The problem? The overvalued dollar. The US dollar was too strong. Throughout the early 1980s, American interest rates were high, a policy meant to crush inflation. But those high rates made the dollar expensive. U.S. exports became overpriced, and imports from countries like Japan and Germany flooded in. America's trade deficit soared to record levels. Its manufacturing industry screamed for relief. So the Reagan administration sought a solution, one that required other nations' cooperation. Inside the Plaza Hotel, the meeting included 5 nations: the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, the United Kingdom. Together they represented the world's largest economies, known as the G5. Their mission, to realign global currencies. Specifically, to weaken the dollar and strengthen the yen and the German mark. The agreement they signed became known as the Plaza Accord, named after the very hotel where it was born. What the Plaza Accord did. The idea sounded simple. If the yen rose in value, Japanese goods would become more expensive in the U.S., and American products would become more competitive abroad. The U.S. would sell more cars, more planes, more technology, and shrink its trade deficit. For Washington it was a clever fix. For Tokyo it was a ticking bomb. Japan's economy depended on exports. Raising the yen was like cutting oxygen to its industries. Yet Japan couldn't refuse. The U.S. was its biggest trading partner, and its military protector. Saying no wasn't an option. The yen skyrockets. Within 2 years of the Plaza Accord, the yen's value doubled against the dollar. In 1985, one US dollar bought 250 yen. By 1988, it bought only 120 yen. To American consumers, Japanese imports suddenly looked expensive. But for Japanese companies, profits evaporated overnight. Exports fell. Factories slowed. Japan faced the risk of a recession. And that's when the Bank of Japan made a fateful decision. Cheap money floods the system. To keep the economy alive, the Bank of Japan slashed interest rates to near zero. The goal was to stimulate spending and investment, to offset the export slowdown caused by the stronger yen. Money became cheap. Too cheap. Corporations borrowed massively. Banks lent freely. People speculated on real estate and stocks, believing prices would never fall. Tokyo's property market went insane. A small apartment in central Tokyo could cost millions. Office towers sold for astronomical sums. At one point, the land beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was valued higher than all the land in California combined. Japan had entered an economic hallucination. But instead of seeing the danger, the world saw admiration. The illusion of endless prosperity. Newspapers called it the Japanese Miracle 2.0. The Nikkei stock index hit 39,000 points, nearly quadruple its 1985 level. Japanese art auctions broke records. Corporations held lavish parties. People quit stable jobs to become day traders or land investors. Banks issued loans worth 10 times their actual capital base. Everyone believed Japan had found the secret to eternal wealth. But underneath the glittering surface, cracks were forming. The entire boom was built on debt, and the central bank's artificially low interest rates. Japan was living in a bubble, one created by trying to fix another problem caused by the Plaza Accord. America's silent smile. In Washington, officials watched quietly. America's trade deficit began to shrink. Its industries regained some competitiveness. The dollar's fall stabilized the global system, but Japan was absorbing the shock. Few realized it then, but the Plaza Accord had accomplished far more than rebalancing trade. It had shifted the world's economic center of gravity back toward the United States. The price? Japan's future. The collapse, the lost decade, and the lessons of history. The breaking point, 1989 to 1991. Every bubble ends the same way, not with a bang but with a whisper. And for Japan, that whisper came in the late 1980s, when the numbers stopped making sense. The alarm no one heard. By 1989, land prices in Tokyo had risen over 700% in just a few years. The Nikkei stock index had soared to 39,000 points, a price-to-earnings ratio beyond reason. Yet bankers, politicians, and business leaders refused to believe it was a bubble. Land prices can't fall, they said. There's no more land in Tokyo. The media echoed the same confidence. But behind the scenes, the Bank of Japan began to panic. The interest rate shock. In 1989, the Bank of Japan, alarmed by runaway speculation, decided to raise interest rates. Slowly at first, then rapidly. Within just 1 year, the base rate climbed from 2.5% to 6%. That may sound small, but in a debt-fueled economy, it was a death sentence. Overnight, loans became expensive. Property developers defaulted. Stocks began to fall. Investors who once made fortunes watched their portfolios collapse. The popping of the bubble. By 1990, the illusion shattered. Real estate prices plunged. The Nikkei lost half its value in less than a year. But instead of letting the bubble burst cleanly, Japan tried to cushion the fall. Banks refused to mark bad loans as losses. Corporations kept zombie subsidiaries alive through creative accounting. The government launched massive stimulus packages, highways, public works, and bailouts. Yet none of it stopped the collapse. The more Japan tried to fix the problem, the deeper it sank. The beginning of the lost decade. By 1992, Japan had entered what economists later called the lost decade. But it didn't last 10 years. It lasted more than 30. The GDP stagnated. Prices deflated. Banks stopped lending. People hoarded cash, afraid to spend. Businesses froze wages. Young workers faced lifetime underemployment. The very nation that once symbolized unstoppable progress stood still. And while Japan suffered, the world moved on. The fallout, a generation frozen in time, 1990s, 2000s. What happens when an entire generation loses faith in the future? Japan became the answer to that question. The corporate zombies. In most capitalist economies, when companies fail, they go bankrupt, making room for new ones. But in Japan, the government and banks refused to let big firms die. Instead, they propped them up with low-interest loans, creating what economists call zombie companies. These corporations neither grew nor died. They just survived, draining capital from the system. By 1998, more than one-third of Japan's major corporations were zombies, alive only because banks were too afraid to admit their losses. Productivity plummeted. Innovation stalled. Japan, once a symbol of modernity, started to feel like a country stuck in the past. The human cost. For ordinary people, the pain was quiet but relentless. College graduates faced employment ice ages, years when major companies simply stopped hiring. Middle-aged men, once symbols of lifetime security, were laid off for the first time in their lives. Suicide rates rose. Birth rates fell. The dream of the 1980s, the house, the savings, the secure job, disappeared. Sociologists began calling them the lost generation. Deflation, the silent killer. Most people fear inflation. But Japan faced something worse, deflation. Prices kept falling year after year. That might sound good, until you realize what it does to an economy. When people expect prices to drop, they stop spending, because tomorrow everything will be cheaper. Companies cut prices, then wages. Profits shrink. It's a downward spiral that feeds itself. The Bank of Japan tried to fight back, lowering interest rates to zero, then below zero. But nothing worked. The engine of Japan's miracle had gone cold. The U.S. moves ahead. While Japan was stuck, America surged forward. The 1990s brought the dot-com boom, Silicon Valley, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon. The U.S. became the undisputed economic leader again. Ironically, the same country that pressured Japan into revaluing the yen now benefited from the world's new imbalance. Capital fled Japan's deflationary economy and poured into the American stock market. The global center of innovation moved west and never came back. Failed fixes and the endless loop, 2000s, 2010s. Japan tried everything and nothing worked. Stimulus without growth. Between 1992 and 2010, Japan launched over 15 stimulus packages totaling hundreds of trillions of yen. The government built roads, bridges, tunnels, even where no one needed them. Rural areas filled with bridges to nowhere. The idea was to inject money into the economy, but it only created temporary jobs, not sustainable growth. The national debt exploded to over 200% of GDP, the highest among developed nations. Japan wasn't growing. It was surviving. The myth of quantitative easing. In the early 2000s, Japan pioneered a new concept, quantitative easing (QE), printing money to buy government bonds and flood the system with liquidity. The hope? That cheap money would spark lending and spending. But it didn't. Banks hoarded reserves. Consumers kept saving. Japan became the first nation to prove that you can't print your way out of a psychological crisis. The problem wasn't just money, it was confidence. The lost decade had scarred an entire generation's mindset. The demographic time bomb. And then came another crisis, slower but more devastating. Japan's population began to shrink. The birth rate fell below 1.3 children per woman, far below the replacement level. By 2020, nearly 30% of Japan's population was over 65 years old. Fewer workers meant lower productivity, higher social costs, and weaker demand. Economists called it the silver tsunami. Japan's once youthful, energetic economy had aged, just like its people. The Abenomics experiment. In 2012, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe promised a revival. His plan, called Abenomics, had three arrows: aggressive monetary easing, fiscal stimulus, structural reform. It sounded revolutionary. For a moment, optimism returned. The yen weakened, exports rose, the stock market rallied. But deep down, Japan's problems remained. Corporate culture resisted change. Immigration stayed limited. Consumption taxes returned. By the late 2010s, growth slowed again. The lost decade had become the lost era. Modern parallels. History repeats itself. You might think Japan's story is a relic of the past, a cautionary tale for history books. But what if it's actually a preview of our own future? The American echo. After 2008, the United States faced its own financial bubble and its own crash. The Federal Reserve slashed interest rates to zero and began massive quantitative easing, just like Japan had done decades earlier. The result? Asset prices soared, inequality widened, and debt reached historic levels. Sound familiar? Economists began whispering, "Are we becoming Japan? China's shadow." But it's not just America. Look east, to China. 4 years, China's growth has mirrored Japan's 1980s boom. Massive exports, cheap loans, real estate speculation, and government-guided capitalism. In cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen, property prices have reached levels few can afford. Local governments rely on land sales for revenue. Banks are loaded with risky loans. And now, with population decline and falling demand, cracks are showing. Evergrande's collapse, ghost cities, youth unemployment, all echo Japan's path before its crash. History isn't repeating perfectly, but it's rhyming loudly. The global warning. The world has learned how to create wealth, but not how to sustain it. Every few decades, nations forget the same lessons. Cheap money creates bubbles. Bubbles create illusions. Illusions create denial. And when reality returns, decades are lost. Japan was just the first. The takeaways: 3 lessons from the lost decade. So, what can we learn from Japan's tragedy, and how can we avoid repeating it? Let's end with 3 powerful takeaways. Takeaway 1: growth built on debt is not real growth. Japan's bubble wasn't driven by innovation, it was driven by speculation. When easy money replaces real productivity, wealth becomes an illusion. The same pattern can be seen in the U.S. housing bubble of 2008, or in today's tech and crypto speculation. Sustainable growth must come from real value, not cheap credit. Takeaway 2: confidence is everything. Money isn't just paper, it's belief. Once people lose confidence in the system, no amount of stimulus or policy can bring it back easily. Japan's greatest enemy wasn't deflation, it was despair. A generation that stops believing in the future, stops building it. Takeaway 3. History rewards adaptation, not perfection. Japan perfected efficiency, but failed to adapt. Its rigid corporate culture, lifetime employment, and aging population made reinvention almost impossible. Nations that adapt, like South Korea, Singapore, and even post-crisis America, find renewal. Those that cling to the past, no matter how perfect, fade into it. Conclusion: a warning for the future. In the end, Japan's lost decade was more than an economic event. It was a human story, of ambition, pride, and tragedy. A nation that did everything right, until it didn't. Some say Japan was tricked by the U.S. through the Plaza Accord. Others say it was undone by its own arrogance. The truth lies somewhere in between. But one thing is certain: in a global system built on finance, no one truly wins when someone else falls. Japan's downfall stabilized the world economy for a moment, but it left a scar that still hasn't healed. Today, as new bubbles form in different corners of the world, Japan's story whispers a warning. It can happen again. It always can. If you found this story eye-opening, there's more to uncover. History hides patterns, and the next economic trap may already be forming. Don't just watch the future unfold, understand it. Subscribe to World Financial Mysteries, where every episode reveals the hidden forces shaping our world economy. Because the next lost decade might already be starting somewhere else.